All right. Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. I'm super happy to have all of you here for our API Developer Day with Kong Insomnia and Kong Connect. My name is Dalia and I work as a Senior Developer Marketing Manager here at Kong. I have Vince and Michael with us today. I will let them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit more about what they do here at Kong. This developer day is being recorded. We will also have a workshop as part of it. You can follow it live, or you can just watch and then follow by the recording that you will receive in the next 24 hours. Please post all of your questions on the bottom. You can see a Q&A function. So let's use that for all of the questions so then we can keep track of them easily. And for anything else, you can use the chat function if you have any problems hearing or for anything else, please post it there. And like I said, we are recording this. So you will receive the recording, I think, in the next 24 hours with some helpful resources as well. It will also be uploaded to our YouTube channel. I will post a link in the chat so you can also subscribe there. And yeah, with that, Michael, please take it away from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dahlia. And yeah, welcome everyone to Insomnia's Developer Day. And so today, obviously, we'll be focusing quite a bit on Kong Insomnia, but we're going to be expanding that with Kong Connect to kind of touch on the entire API lifecycle and what that might look like. And so for folks that don't know me, I'm Michael Field. I'm a technical PMM here at Kong, and I led the Insomnia 101 and 201 workshops leading up to this. And today we are also joined by Vince. Vince, if you want to introduce yourself real quick.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vince Russo. I'm a senior solutions engineer here that works with Michael and the team from a technical perspective.
Great. Glad to have you today, Vince. And Vince will be covering some of the things related to Kong Connect as we get to that part of the API lifecycle. So just a high level overview of what we're going to be covering today. Again, we'll spend kind of the first, 15, 20 minutes. We're going to go through some slides for folks who maybe have not joined the earlier workshops, give a little background in Insomnia and Kong Connect as well, and how they can actually play together for managing your APIs across the full lifecycle. Then we'll spend the majority of today going through a workshop. You can follow along today if you have all the prereq setups, which we'll touch on in the next slide. But if something's not working for you, you get stuck, you fall behind, or you're missing one of the prerequisites, don't worry. Like Dalia mentioned, this is all recorded. We have a public repo you can clone, and this is something you can try on your own time as well if you would just like to watch today. And at the end, we'll have some dedicated time to wrap up with a Q&A. But as we're going, if you have questions about anything that we show during the workshop, feel free to throw it in the chat. Whoever is not presenting will be monitoring that chat so we can respond in real time. We're happy to back things up and help clarify things for folks. So before we get into the kind of background presentation on Insomnia and Kong Connect, just want to show the prereqs here for the workshop. A lot of these are similar to the 201 workshop. So again, you're going to need some kind of IDE, like a VS Code. You need to have a JavaScript runtime installed to actually run the API itself. So something like Node.js. Need a couple of CLI tools. So of course, you'll need Git to actually clone the repo locally to your machine. And then you're going to need both the inso CLI and the deck CLI tool, which can be easily installed on your computer. If you're using something like Mac, you can install both of these with Homebrew. And then last but certainly not least, obviously you're going to need an Insomnia account. But to fully complete today's workshop, you'll also need a Kong Connect account. If you don't have one, super easy to go ahead and get signed up with a free 30-day trial. So again, as we're going through the presentation, if you would like to try to follow along in real time today, you have 15, 20 minutes to go kind of pull all this tooling down and go ahead and get it installed. If you run into any issues, throw it in the chat and we'll try to help you out in real time. But before we get to the fun stuff in the workshop, let's do a little bit of background on the main focus today, which of course is Kong Insomnia. So what is Kong Insomnia? So if you've never heard of it before, it's an API client and it's really focused on the build stage of the API lifecycle. Insomnia is going to give you everything you need to design, test, and debug your APIs. So if we kind of see this little zoomed in view of the build stage here, it's a little kind of mini life cycle, but again, just focus on the build stage of the overall API life cycle. We can start here in the bottom left. And so what Insomnia allows you to do is to take a design first approach to your APIs. So start with the actual open API specification and build that out in real time. This is something we've seen both in the 101 and the 201 workshop. And what's cool about using this editor is you can actually has a built-in linter that of course will make it adhere to, the standard open API specification rules. But you can also have your own organizational standards and guidelines. So if you have custom linting rules or custom guidelines about how you want your schemas designed for your APIs, those can also be enforced inside Insomnia. Now, as you're building out your different endpoints, and you might not have actually stood up your backend API, you can actually mock these API endpoints and start testing them early on inside of the design stage. From there, again, before you've actually built anything, before you've written any code, you can start writing the test for your APIs. And this is something we're actually going to see during the workshop today. This is called taking it TDD, test-driven development, and it's where you write the test before you actually write any code. And we'll kind of see what that iterative cycle will look like working inside Insomnia today. Now, once you've written some of your tests and then you actually start implementing and writing some of the code for your backend API, of course, with the collection runner inside Insomnia, you can actually start debugging those services. And it's really flexible. So whether you're building a REST API, a SOAP service, GraphQL, service and events, WebSockets, gRPC, regardless of the protocol, this is supported inside Insomnia. And so a lot of flexibility for all the different APIs and services you might be building inside of your organization today. Now, as you're building out these APIs and you're writing all these different tests, maybe you're building these different mocking services, of course, the question that's going to come up is, how is all this data being stored? And this is a huge strength of Insomnia is when it comes to storage flexibility. Now, of course, we have built-in cloud storage where everything is end-to-end encrypted and securely it's stored. But if you don't want any of your data stored in the cloud, that's totally an option with Insomnia. You can have everything stored inside of Git. And so you can use your own GitHub repositories, whether it's living inside of something like GitHub or GitLab, wherever you are storing those repos and that data, you can use that to store all your Insomnia data as well. So you kind of have total flexibility within your organization of where that data gets stored. And then last but certainly not least, as you're kind of working on this build pipeline, Insomnia has the ability with the inso CLI tool, which again was one of the prereqs we discussed on the previous slide, to integrate with your CI/CD automation pipelines. So again, we'll kind of show this through the workshop today, but you might start with this manual kind of clickouts approach as you're building everything out. But eventually you want to get to a fully automated pipeline, both for efficiency reasons, but also reducing bugs as you get to production. Automation pipelines are really about reducing errors, and the inso CLI makes Insomnia easy to integrate with your existing CI/CD pipelines. Now, additionally, as we talked about, this is just the build stage. We'll talk about this a bit more in later slides, but we're going to integrate with Kong Konnect to also touch on the later stages of the API lifecycle. So now moving forward to the next slide here. A lot of people, again, will ask with Insomnia, I understand it's an API client, but I already have curl. Curl's already installed on everybody's machine. Why do I need an additional API client? So what I often like to say is, Insomnia is more than curl. And I like to kind of break this up into three very broad categories. So first and foremost, why Insomnia is more than curl is because APIs are not designed in silos. APIs are built across teams. So there's a collaborative aspect to building APIs, and Insomnia enables easy real-time collaboration across your teams. Now, again, the means of collaboration will be tied to the means of storage, and Insomnia is quite flexible there. So whether you're utilizing cloud storage or you're utilizing Git storage inside of your own repositories, we're still going to help you enable real-time collaboration across your teams. We're going to allow you to set up all your organizations and have full role-based access control inside of those organizations. So as you provision new users, they're going to have their permissions set, based off their role inside of the organization and what do you want them focusing on, whether they're more focused on the pure design stage and working on the spec, or maybe more on the testing side of that particular API. Now, as you're working collaborative across teams, it's not just limited to RBAC when it comes to security controls. Insomnia is extremely robust when it comes to security. Now, I know this is something I've already mentioned numerous times, but it's not really something I can harp on enough. There's storage flexibility. So again, if you want to use your own Git repos to store all your data, that's an option. But if you do want to utilize cloud storage, this is end-to-end encrypted. Okay, so it's also the option where you can bring your own key. This is very securely stored. So again, this is data that not even our own engineers or our own teams can access because you're going to have your own encryption key that you can bring. You also have the ability, of course, for integrating with your identity provider of choice and having single sign-on for all your users. This can be over the SAML protocol or OpenID Connect. If you want to take that a step further with managing your users inside of that identity provider, we're going to support the SCIM protocol as well for provisioning and managing those users and assigning them to different teams. So again, kind of tying back to that role-based access control. But security extends beyond just the user management and, securely storing that data. Is a lot of times inside of this build stage is you're going to have a lot of, kind of private data, things like API keys, variables that you do not want getting exposed or, of course, leaking. These are very valuable credentials when it comes to using and testing these APIs. So Insomnia helps with that in a few ways. So when it comes to managing your environments, you can have shared environments between your teams, but developers can also create their own private environments. But also, we have recently introduced the ability to integrate with different secrets managers. So this includes all the major cloud providers, so GCP, AWS, and their types of secret managers, but also things like HashiCorp Vault. And so what that allows you to do is completely take the management and store those, and again, that third-party provider, and then link to those secrets inside Insomnia. So there's no risk of them leaking outside to anybody. And again, access is managed inside of your secret manager of choice. So that covers the security side of Insomnia. But there's really one more major reason why Insomnia is so much more than curl. And that comes down to the bucket of what I call the kind of, you could say it's three separate buckets, but I put testing, mocking, and automation inside of one large bucket here. Now, testing and mocking is something we covered more in depth here in the 201 workshop. And we covered that with the pre-request and the post-response scripting. And we'll be doing more of that inside of the workshop today. But that allows you to really build out robust unit testing for all your different API endpoints. And tied to that is also the mocking servers that you can stand up. So you can start testing out these endpoints again before you've actually written any of your backend code. And covering all that was a huge focus of the 201 workshop. But we really kind of let that focus to kind of the manual building out of those tests. And the final step of that is integrating that inside of your automation pipelines, which will be a focus of what we're doing today, where Vince and I will kind of be standing up a full CI/CD pipeline. And again, the major reason you want to do this inside of your organization is yes, increased efficiency. You'll see how long it takes Vince and I to build this all out by hand and how much more efficient this is when we just have an automation pipeline set up and running. But it's really about increased governance across that full life cycle. If you want to be able to iterate quickly with fewer bugs inside of your organization, you need a pipeline that runs in a reproducible manner every single time. And it's also auditable. If there is some kind of mistake or error, it's easy to go back and check logs and see exactly what went wrong. And it's going to be predictable, right? If Vince and I did the same workshop 100 times, we're going to be bound to make certain mistakes inside of that workshop. You run a pipeline 100 times, it's going to run the exact same way all 100 times. It's much better and much stronger when it comes to governance inside of your organization and managing your APIs. So I know for folks that have joined previous workshops, this is kind of an overview you heard before. If you're new to this, hopefully that was a helpful background on what Insomnia is. But now I'm going to hand things over to Vince to give a brief background on Kong Konnect, because this is what we're going to use to manage the later stages of the API lifecycle after we build our API. So Vince, take it away.
Thanks. So Kong Konnect is the core platform of Kong. If you're familiar with our offerings utilizing Insomnia, we also offer a gateway. The Kong gateway has been around for many years, and we took a concerted effort to become more cloud native and cloud ready, and Kong Konnect was the offshoot of that. So if you go to the next slide, Michael. Ultimately, it is a cloud services management plane. So as you can see here, we have several lines of offerings from a product perspective and a services perspective. Gateway Manager will be the core focus of the demo today. That is the entity that contains all of the mappings for the routes and services that Michael will use during the demo, and all the various plugins for providing things like governance and rate limiting and whatnot. But there's also other aspects to the platform as well. If you're interested in mesh-based workloads, you're able to utilize the Mesh Manager to give a single pane of glass for all of your microservice architecture using Kong Mesh. We have a developer portal that utilizes API product for publishing and hosting the Open API spec. One of the aspects of the demo that we'll be running today is utilizing Open API spec as a source of truth a requirements definition for how we do design-driven approach, and the developer portal is the component of Kong Connect that is dedicated to hosting and sharing and publishing those specs to the internal team and to a broader, larger external customer of yours that you may need to share your documentation. To that regard, we also have the service catalog. This was built with the huge success of the developer portal, in that we have an internal only facing tool that allows you to add things like Insomnia collections, GitHub repos, PagerDuty, traceable definitions, all of the interconnected services and products that go into application development and service deployment and maintenance can all be found in the service catalog. This was built for an internal tool to help teams collaborate and share what they've been working on. So a lot of what you see today could eventually be baked in the service catalog to make it really easy to reproduce. So we're going to go from, manual creation of every single piece to API pipeline, and then, the day 4, day 5 operations would be, let's bake all this into a single service catalog. So when we onboard a new team, we'll be able to share that information and make it easy to view that content. All of this plays with all the various products that we have between an AI gateway and an API gateway and an ingress controller and so on and so forth. If you want to go to the next slide. Now, one of the focuses of what we're working on today is a separate working environment. Michael has his environment installed locally. I have my environment installed locally. But effectively, we're going to play as two different teams or two different organizations working with the same product. If you were to do this without a cloud-based solution, I would have to have everything ran locally testing in my side. Then I'd potentially have to move it or check it into a staging process and move it into a different machine. And then Michael would have to download it and get that information and test it on his side. The whole point of us using a SaaS-based solution for at least the control plane or the management plane allows me to work on my machine, share it in the SaaS, and then Michael can effectively download it and configure it on his machine without any sort of migration or changeover policies required. This is designed to help with things like configuration drift, standardization of configuration, and just really streamline the process of collaboration, especially with global teams. The idea being, I'm in Atlanta, he's in Denver. If we had a team in Singapore, a team in Ireland, we could all cross collaborate without having to move and manage and migrate all these different workloads. So that's what we're going to be highlighting today in the demo, is just this separate working environment while all communicating across the same pipelines and the same infrastructure. So that's all I had for the Kong Connect overview. In the demo, you'll see more of the live action of all the different bits moving in concert. So
Awesome.
back to you.
Get that overview, Vince. Okay, so we're almost to the slides here. I know folks are probably eager to kind of get more hands on keyboard and get into the workshop, but really want to highlight the story we're trying to tell here is the better together story between Insomnia and Kong Connect, right? What we want to manage is this overall API lifecycle, and Kong provides the tooling to manage that full lifecycle when you combine Insomnia and Kong Connect. So we like to break out the API lifecycle into kind of these broad 4 stages. You want to be able to build, run, discover, and govern your APIs. So again, our major focus here today with Insomnia during the build stage, where basically API owners or publishers or whatever you might call that particular persona can come out and design, debug, and test their APIs and make this available to consumers who want to use it. Then as Vince will show, when we were ready to actually make that API available in production, we don't want to just expose that server, completely on its own. We want to stand up a gateway in front of it to enforce things like security, through things like auth and rate limiting. We want to help performance with things like caching, and we want things like observability too, which we're going to need that gateway in front to capture all those analytics across all of our APIs. Now, once the API is now protected behind a gateway, we need to make it discoverable to all of our users. So as Vince mentioned, also part of the Kong Konnect platform is we have things like a developer portal for discovery for external consumers. And that could be external to your team, but still inside of the same organization. Or it could be external to your org. Maybe you're trying to monetize those APIs, but some kind of self-serve portal where basically people can go find documentation, understand how an API works, and request access to that API. But it's not just limited to external developers. You might have a platform team that's looking to catalog all these APIs and services inside of a service catalog and ensure all these APIs, which could be hundreds or thousands across large organizations, adhere to certain standards. So, you want to track things like the latency of the API. You also want to be able to link the spec and make sure it adheres to organizational guidelines. And so Service Catalog has this concept of scorecards, which kind of give you this overview immediately of all your APIs and services inside the catalog to see which ones adhere to that scorecard and which ones are failing. And then last but certainly not least, across this entire pipeline, you want to have some form of governance and control. And again, the way we're going to do that is through guardrails set up inside of an automated pipeline, starting all the way out in that build stage, through the run stage, and the discovery stage. And Vince and I, again, will be showing how to build out that pipeline today. So moving on just here real quick to kind of the last slide, just to hone in on what that automation pipeline is going to look like is again, we're going to kind of start with the spec. We're going to take a design first approach to our API spec. And, after we make that change, maybe we're building out a new endpoint. We want to go ahead and lint that spec, make sure it still adheres to our standards. Then we need to convert that spec into something that Kong Konnect understands in the gateway connection proxy. So we're going to merge that, or sorry, we're going to convert that into Kong config. Then the platform team, they want to apply certain policies. So, they want to have rate limiting. They might want to have some kind of auth. So we're going to merge in all these plugins and we're going to validate that config to make sure it's still correct and will actually run on the gateway. And then the last thing we'll do before we actually apply that config is we're actually going to save the existing config. And if there's any issues trying to apply those changes, we always want to have the ability to quickly roll back so there's no downtime experience on the gateway. As Vince and I are doing this manually today, if either of us click a wrong thing, hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully the demo gods are looking out for us today. But if it does happen, it's going to take us some time to figure out what went wrong. And if this was a production use case, obviously that's a massive issue now. Now we have downtime in production. People can't access the APIs. With an automation pipeline, if anything goes wrong, you can immediately roll back to an existing state and minimize or completely eliminate any downtime in your production APIs. And then, of course, once we have things actually running behind the gateway, we want to run our whole suite of tests. Again, this is something we focus more on inside of the 201 workshop, but we want to have some kind of collection runner where we're going to run iterations where we're pumping in, variations of different data we might see from API consumers and make sure all those APIs are behaving exactly as expected.
I did want to add one thing,
Yeah,
Michael. That deck file merge you see right in the middle of your screen, this is actually very subtle, but a pretty important aspect to this. What this allows you to do is to separate the concerns of security and governance and oversight from what your developers are working on. Now, you can have your developers understand that they need to write tests to validate that an auth went by or to double check to make sure the rate limiting plugin was applied. But the whole purpose of this merge function is to effectively apply a standard set of configuration when it comes to security, when it comes to governance, that is not a responsibility of the development team and ensures that it happens every single time. That way we are secure by default. That can kind of get lost in translation, but it's really important to know it's a small piece, but a very important one for this pipeline.
No, that's a great call out, Vince. And honestly, it's a great transition into kind of how we'll be approaching the workshop today. As you guys are building out these APIs in production, especially across larger enterprises, it's really not just one person. It's probably not just two people either. You have these larger teams with very focused responsibilities. And so Vince and I during the workshop today will be kind of representing different personas. So I'm going to be kind of the API designer or the backend engineer building out that API. And then I'm going to be handing it off to Vince, who's kind of going to be representing the larger platform team and we'll be managing exactly what Vince just talked about, making sure it's secure, it's performant, and these different plugins are in place to actually stand up this API in production. So without further ado, let's get kind of beyond the slides here. So We're going to transition into the workshop now. Again, for folks who want to try to follow along today in real time, this is the public repo that you want to access here. So let me go ahead and just share this link inside the chat so you don't have to type it manually. I can get to it, chat here, and let's send this out to everybody. So just go ahead and check that link, Vince, and everybody else. Make sure that link is working and can access that public repo there.
I have access.
Perfect. If anybody has any issues, just let us know inside the chat there. But go ahead and clone that repo locally. That's what we're going to be working out of. It has everything you need. It has the starter Insomnia collection. It's going to have all the code for the backend API that we're working with, and it's going to have the pieces that we're going to use to put together the automation pipeline. So what are we doing in today's workshop? So from a very high level, we're going to have three main stages. Like I mentioned, I'm going to be kind of working as that backend engineer who's going to take a design first approach to building this API. We're going to do some test driven development, and we're actually going to iterate on our API and add a new endpoint. Once I complete that, I'm going to hand things off over to Vince saying, hey, let's get this stood up in production. Let's get a gateway put in front of this. Let's add in some different policies, some security and rate limiting. So you guys can kind of see, how do we move beyond just that build stage and see some of the later stages of the API lifecycle and how Insomnia and Kong Connect can actually work together. But these first two stages, we're going to be doing everything manually. We're going to be doing a ClickOps approach. You guys are going to be seeing all this going on inside the UI. But once we actually get through that process, hopefully that goes smoothly and it's not error prone. But what we want to see is what is an API ops pipeline doing everything we do manually, all in kind of one smooth pipeline, one click, and we're going to see everything run through and run all of this. And again, kind of a fully automated fashion. And we're going to utilize GitHub Actions inside of that Git repo. So important to mention for step 3, if you want to try to run the pipeline yourself, you're actually going to need to fork the repo. So you can actually change some of the secrets and run the GitHub Actions yourself. And again, this is something you can try after the call today too. We're going to be running it inside of the main repo. All right, so let's go ahead then, and we'll come back to that at the end here. And let's go ahead and get out of slide mode. Now, the first thing to mention here inside this repo, let's go back to the main page here, is the collection that we're going to be starting with here is inside the repo itself. So the YAML file. So I'm going to switch over to Insomnia now. And if, again, you want to follow along in real time, what you can do is download that YAML file and you can import it right here. So go ahead and just choose that file, scan it, and you should be able to import it directly inside Insomnia. Now, I'm a little bit ahead of things, so I already have that set up here. You should have this Insomnia Dev Day document set up. And this should look familiar for anybody who's kind of completed the earlier workshops. It's a somewhat similar API, and hopefully, again, you've seen kind of this design editor where we can actually see the open API spec. So the API we're going to be working with today is a super basic API. To start with, we just have 5 endpoints for this item API. And you can kind of see what we're building out here is a skeleton for an API that might be powering something like a to-do list. So we have the ability to get all the items inside of our to-do list. We can create a new item. We can return specific items inside of that to-do list by an ID. We can update an item, so change the completion status, maybe change the name of that task using the put endpoint here. And then, of course, we have the ability to actually delete tasks inside of our to-do list. So over here, we can see the actual open API spec for all these different endpoints. And we'll be going into some of the detail here in just a little bit. But we also actually are going to have this API up and running in the background. So if you have gone ahead and cloned the repo, this is where you want to open up that repo inside of your IDE of choice. So this could be something like VS Code or Cursor, which is going to look quite similar to VS Code here. And so the main thing we want to look at here is basically under the routes directory here, we have this items.js file. And this is basically where all the routes for our different endpoints are going to live. So kind of matching to the spec we just looked at, we have our get endpoint here to return all the items inside of our to-do list. We can get a specific item. We can create a new item here, and here's the actual code that will do that and push it to our database. We don't actually have a database. Everything's just going to be stored locally here. Again, the ability to actually update an existing item and, of course, delete an existing item. So this is just using Express.js, very basic API here. And this is what we're going to be kind of modifying and working with today, utilizing Insomnia as our build tool. Just a few other things to cover. Again, like I mentioned, all the data is just being stored locally. So when you actually start up this Express server, you're always going to have two items here by default. And these are tasks that you can modify and delete as well. And then, of course, you kind of have your index file, which is actually starting up the Express server itself. Okay, but we're mostly going to be focusing on the kind of the page with all the routes, this items.js file. So the first thing you want to do is open up your terminal inside your IDE. And again, I already have everything installed, but if you don't, assuming you already have npm up and going, just hit npm install. That's going to install all the packages that you need to actually run this server. And then to get things running, basically all you need to do is run npm run dev, and that is going to start up your Express server. You should see similar kind of output here inside of your terminal, and it's telling us, hey, the server is now running locally on port 3000. So to go ahead and test that, let's jump back to Insomnia and see if things are actually working here. So again, we're inside of our spec tab right now, but let's go ahead and switch over to the collection tab. And we can see we already have things set up for basically each of the 5 endpoints that we were looking at previously. So let's go in first and see if we can create a new item inside of our server. So one thing to check here is making sure you're inside the right environment. So if you click up here, mine says main environment, yours could say something slightly differently, but make sure you select that main environment. It could be set to base environment. It might be set to gateway environment, but we want to make sure to start here, we're running inside the main environment and we have that green check mark here. And you should see your URL preview should look similar to mine. So again, that server is running locally on port 3000. And we're going to send a post request to the items endpoint. And we're basically going to create a new task here, just called sample task. So I'm going to go ahead and send that request now. And we get a 201 created. We can see some tests were run with this and everything passed. So the API is behaving as expected. To go ahead and see that item, let's go to the get all items endpoint and send another request in here. Okay, so we get a 200. And what we'll see is we get those two tasks that are always going to be there by default when you start the server up, the learn Insomnia task and the build an API task. But we've also created our new task here. We have our sample task. And again, we got a 200. We can see our tests are running. We check the status. We did get a 200 and we did get an array inside the response. So this endpoint also behaving as expected. And again, if you did the 201 workshop, most of these endpoints should look familiar. If we want to update this and change the name of that task. So again, right now, the item we just created, right now it's just called sample task. But if we want to go ahead and update that and provide a new name, we can go ahead and change it now to V2 sample task. And if I go back here and list all the items here, instead of just being sample task with the completion status of false, that has now been updated to the V2 sample task, and it's updated to a completion status of true. So everything's working here exactly as we would hope. Everything's running smoothly. We can see every time we send these requests, all of our tests are passing. So again, now I'm the backend engineer responsible for kind of maintaining this API, updating this API. And the scenario we have here is basically people had said, okay, it's great I can update this API, but perhaps maybe I only want to change the name or I only want to change the completion status. And the put in point's not that flexible. Essentially, you have to update everything at once every time you want to modify one of these tasks. It's kind of an all or nothing. So folks are asking for a patch endpoint where we can update one or the other, something that's a little bit more flexible. So to do that, we're going to take a design first approach. Before we write any code, before we modify our Express server in any way, we're actually going to come here and start back with the actual Open API specification. So inside the repo, we actually have everything you need here. You can kind of scroll down here. It's going to give you a little background on what we're doing today. But the different stuff I copy in here, you can go ahead and grab directly from the repo itself. So now I'm going to jump back to Insomnia. Under the delete endpoint, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go paste in our patch endpoint here, and then we'll talk through everything that's going on. Let's delete all that white space, paste that in, and then let's get that on the same level. So highlight everything that you just pasted in. Let's give it 2 tabs so it matches in. Oh, sorry, 3 tabs. Need one more there. that guy. And maybe it's not liking in. All right, we get to do some more live debugging here. Okay, so our responses object did not get moved forward. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and paste everything in again. Make sure we grab the whole thing. And let's get that on the right level. There we go. So our linter was working correctly there. I did not grab the full responses object and move that up to the right level. So now that everything has the right indentation level, we can see our linting has no lint problem. So everything is working as expected. And we can see over here in our preview, now we have a new patch endpoint. So let's do kind of a quick walkthrough of what we are attempting to build out with this patch endpoint. So at the beginning here, we have some basic metadata with that patch endpoint. And let me see if I can actually make this a little bit larger so hopefully folks can read this fine. So we give a little bit of a summary, a description. Of course, the operation ID is we're actually going to patch it. Now, anytime that folks want to use this patch endpoint, we're expecting a couple of parameters. So inside of the actual path, we need them to pass to some type of ID. So because they are going to be modifying an existing task and not creating a new one, we need to pass the ID of the task that they actually want to modify. That's the same as the delete endpoint, the put endpoint, and the get endpoint when they're trying to get a specific item by the ID. Now, the other thing they need to do is pass some kind of request body. Again, they're looking to modify an existing patch endpoint. So they don't need to pass a full request body that includes both the completion status and the name, but they do need to provide at least one or the other. So we can see here an example of the content they might pass. So they need to pass a name, which would be an string. So an example might be just the updated name that they want to change the task to. Or they can also provide the completion status. This is going to be a Boolean. So an example would be true, or they could also pass false, whatever they're looking to update that task to. Also included inside of this endpoint is we can see the example responses we might be expecting. So of course, as that patch goes to plan, we're going to get a 200 response. We should get a response that the item was updated successfully, and they're going to get a response that matches the schema that we have here, which is basically the overall schema of the item, which is going to pass back the ID, the name, and the completion status of that item. So that's if everything goes according to plan. But of course, with APIs, we also need to deal with errors and, malformed inputs provided by developers as well. So one of these could be a 400. So, they're targeting an existing task, but they don't provide the input correctly. Maybe they're trying to provide a name, but they just give us an empty string. So that'd be an example of an invalid input. So our API needs to handle that. It needs to provide back a 400 response and notify the developer that they've done something wrong so they can go back and check for errors inside of their client. Another option might be a 404. Maybe they're trying to modify an item that does not exist. Maybe they provided the wrong ID. That's something we also need to notify developers of as we're building out this API. Okay, so now we kind of have the design, what we want that patch endpoint to look like. But now we need to focus more on the implementation. But instead of going just to writing code, what we want to do is actually write our test first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and generate an updated collection based off of this patch endpoint. So over here on the left, you hit this little settings icon. We're going to go ahead and generate a new collection. So items main is the folder we started with here. And what I've done is created this new items folder here. Now, these are going to be the same as what we were working with, but they don't have any of the tests completed. So what I want to do is I want to grab this new patch endpoint and I want to drag and drop it into the items main folder. Okay. So now it's over here with all of our other endpoints that already have test. And so what I'm going to do is this new items folder, I'm just going to go ahead and delete it. Okay. So now we have our pre-existing items main folder. Again, you can see all these endpoints. You can see all the tests that we have running for these. That's all working fine. Again, if I go here and I try to create another task, it works. The tests run. But if I try to do this patch endpoint, 404 not found. That endpoint does not exist. So it's not able to patch any kind of item here. So what we need to do now is basically build this endpoint. We need to actually write the code for this. But again, before we do that, we're going to do an approach called test-driven development. And so what we're actually going to do is we're going to write out all the unit tests that kind of that kind of frame and structure this API. And then we're going to write the code to actually make those tests run as we want. So instead of those tests failing, we want to get a green status for all those tests. So if we go back to our GitHub repo and we go down here, we want to grab all these tests for the patch endpoint. So we're going to go ahead and copy these, jump back to Insomnia. We're going to go ahead to our patch endpoint. We're going to go to scripts, and these are going to be after response scripts. So we're going to go ahead and paste these in. So we have a number of different tests here. So the first thing we're doing here is we're going to grab the response code. And so based off the response code for any request, that determines what tests we're going to run. Now, if you remember, we're looking at the spec, we're kind of broadly expecting to see three main things. We're going to expect a 200, a successful patch, and we need to run some tests here to make sure that things were indeed successful. There could be a 400, which is some kind of malformed request body, basically, some kind of wrong input here. So we want some additional tests for 400 code. And then we also have 404. So basically, item was not found. So right now, we're actually getting a 404 because the endpoint was not found. What we need to do is also build a 404 when a specific item is not found. So with those tests now in place, let's go ahead and send this request again. And we see now we have a failing test. So we did get a 404, but like we said, it's not actually a 404 for the unknown ID, which is caught by our second test here. Basically, it's checking for a certain response message and making sure that matches the expected error. And there's an assertion error, and it's expecting to see item not found, but instead it's basically saying, hey, this endpoint's not found, so we can't actually patch the item. So there's some issue here, which of course we know because this doesn't actually exist yet. So with that and now our testing set up, and we're going to look at each of these tests more in depth here in just a minute, we can actually go ahead and start writing some code for our API. So let's go ahead and jump back to our IDE. And we'll go ahead and minimize our terminal here. And again, we want to build out this new endpoint. So to grab this endpoint, again, jump back to the GitHub repo one more time, scroll down past the test, and we're going to grab the code for our Express API. So let's go ahead and drop this in here. And when you save, basically the server will restart automatically. You can see it restarted due to changes, and that endpoint exists now. So the first thing I want to do though is let's just see if that 404 error works properly. So I'm going to comment out, whoops, I'm going to go ahead and comment out part of the code here, but just to see if we can get this 404 working properly if that item does not exist. So what we're going to do, go back here now. What we're going to do is modify the ID we're sending in. Oops. So let's go back here, go inside of our environment. I'm going to modify this to a non-existent ID. And let's go ahead and let's try to patch that now. Okay, so we got a 404 not found, item not found. Now, the item wasn't found, but that's not due to an issue with the API. The API is working as expected. It's a 404, and the response message is exactly what we want to tell the developer and saying, hey, the item that you're trying to patch doesn't exist. It's not there. So let's go ahead and fix that now. So let's go ahead and let's go create a new item. That ID, let's make sure the 423 is inside our environment. Okay, yep, that was updated automatically by our script, 423. Now let's go ahead and try to patch that. Let's send a request. Okay, so we got a 200 from our API. And if we go back and look at that, we see, okay, we just told it to send the response. It wasn't a 404, but it didn't actually work, right? The name wasn't actually patched and the updated field wasn't actually modified. You can see here, it's still set to false and it's still set to sample task. So the API is not behaving as expected, and you can see one of the tests is failing. So let's jump back in here and let's go ahead and bring in these pieces of our API. So this is the actual logic here, right? Basically, if it sees the name inside of here, and it does equal a string, what we want to do is take that name and go ahead and update the item name. And same thing on the completion side. If that field exists inside of the request body, we want to go ahead and take whatever's inside of that completion field, which should be a Boolean, and update the item with that. And then basically we're going to return that item back to the user, and we should be good to go. Now, again, the important thing to note is this is much more flexible than the post endpoint. The post endpoint is expecting both of those to be there. The patch endpoint is checking if either of them are there, so there's a lot more flexible. You can provide both or one or the other. So let's see this in action real quick. Let's go ahead and send another request now. And oh, we need to make sure that actually exists because the server. So every time I make a change, just to show folks this, the server restarts. And when the server restarts, it's basically going to delete any existing tasks in there. So if we actually look at our items now, it's only the starting items. So I need to create a new item yet again. Okay. Now I should be able to patch that item. Okay, so now we see that items returned with an updated name, the completion status has been updated, and all of our tests are passing. Now again, I can provide just one or the other here. So if I want to just modify this to a false completion status, you can imagine this as functionality you might want inside an actual to-do app, where maybe you're tapping the item to complete it or mark it as uncompleted, but you don't necessarily want to change the name. So let's go ahead and try that. Great. The completion status updated, even though the name did not change, and both of our tests have passed. And then let's also go ahead and check our other piece for malformed input. So maybe they try to change the name, but they try to change it to an empty string. So let's send that in. And we see name is required, 400 bad request, and both of our tests have passed as well. So again, pretty cool what we've seen here with Insomnia. We've started with just a spec. We built it up from the spec, worked our way over to the collection. We've done some test-driven development to actually building out this new patch endpoint. And now I, as the backend developer, the API owner, the API designer, whatever you might call that persona, I'm happy with how this API is behaving. And I really want to push this into production. So what I'm going to do now is kind of notify Vince and his team, the platform team, that, hey, I want to push this inside of Kong Konnect. I want to have a gateway in front of this and running before we make this available in production. So Vince, if you also want to start sharing your screen and show folks how we can do that.
Absolutely. All right. So we're going to share at the same time. So I'll share my screen as well. And you can click between the two in the webinar. One second, let me make sure I'm on the right view. All right. So you should be able to have at the top of the webinar's view, there should be two different screens available to click.
I'll show
If
it
you
real quick, Vince, because I can share my screen. So if at the top here, folks are still looking at my screen, you should see two options. So just click on the
you
one.
yeah, Zoom hides its own menu, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, but you at the
But
top
yeah,
bar.
okay, everyone can confirm my screen is available as well. All right,
Cool.
so I am inside of Connect. Now I am just a control plane admin inside of Mike's personal Connect environment, so I won't have all the menus that you would normally see if you had all the permissions. This highlights the fact that Kong has a very robust RBAC system where all you can do is give someone permission to access a single control plane, or when I switch over into my personal control plane, you'll see, admin access to all of the components. Now, once we go inside of the control plane, we'll see we have all of our options for managing Kong, the gateway. As we can see here, there is a current data plane node being run. This is Mike's personal deployment on his machine. I could also launch a data plane node as well by hitting new data plane node, selecting the architecture I want, and then generating a config. Now, from this config, this is actually how you'll do this yourself. So when you register an account, you'll have all of the options available to you. Click into Gateway Manager. I believe you'll have a default control plane called serverless. Let's ignore that for now and create a new control plane called the hybrid mode, so self-managed hybrid. And that will get you to, let's exit real quick. That will get you to this view right here. It should say self-managed gateway and have this kind of pale cloud icon. And once you're inside the control plane, you'll want to launch a data plane node. So new data plane node. Self-managed gateway is the latest version that we have, and then the platform. I prefer Docker. I think it's the easiest to stand up. But if you have a Linux machine that you may want to install onto, or if you have a Kubernetes environment already stood up, you can select that as well. But Docker is really well self-contained, so it's the favorite for me. Um, the Docker run command that we supply is all of the data that the gateway needs to run and then communicate back to the SaaS platform. And this is the part of the collaboration that is infrastructure agnostic. I can run this Docker container on my local machine. I can move it into an AWS or an Azure or GCP environment, and it would still have the same communication and the same environment that Michael would have on his local machine. And this allows me as the platform engineer to create content, test it myself, then send a message over and say, okay, now it's time for you to test it and validate that you can do it as well. So these are the steps you'll want to go through. You just copy this locally and run it locally. Now, I don't have the JS file myself, so I don't have Michael's app, which means that I can't really test the way he can. But as the platform engineer, that's not my job. My job is to just make content and put content for governance sake. So what I'm going to do is go into our control plane and then inside the gateway services. I need to make a new gateway service.
Vince, real quick, if
I'm
you want
sorry.
to pause here real quick. So before, right now, there's no config set up on this gateway, and this is
Right.
what Vince is going to be doing. If folks actually look at my screen again real quick, what I will do is just to show folks that nothing is up and running, and kind of the difference that we're working with. And you can do this inside of your own Insomnia environment as well. So again, if we kind of go back to our main endpoint here, you can see the URL preview. That's going directly to the backend API. But what we're going to do now is stand up a gateway in front of that. So we need to switch environments. So if you click on main environment and you switch here to what's called gateway environment, again, this is included for everybody inside of that Insomnia collection, and check it, we'll see now that the URL has been updated. Instead of going to port 3000, I have it by default going to port 8000, which if you run a gateway locally, that's kind of the default port on Docker. So you can hit your local gateway here, localhost on port 8000. But if I try to do that right now, we get a 404 not found, and we get a response from the gateway that's saying, hey, that gateway service does not exist. So I just want to show folks that as kind of the starting point, and then Vince is actually going to be creating that gateway service now. So back to you, Vince.
Yep. So back to my screen. And we'll make the service, we'll make the route that links that together, and then we'll add a few plugins, and we'll see that information get populated to all of the data planes that are assigned to this control plane, and that one being Michael's default one. So we'll create the new gateway service. There is some special URLs that we need to use because of the way Docker serves traffic. I need to specify that I am actually using I believe it's docker.host.internal. We're listening on port 3000. So
Yeah,
that is,
it might be host.docker
is it
internal.
host.docker? All right. I should have taken better notes. Actually, hold on. I have it in my notes. One second. Let's just double check this just to make sure we're right. It is host.docker.internal. Excellent. Okay. So port 3000. This URL will be parsed and then segmented into a host port path for the purposes of storing the upstream target. So
It's you go back to edit it real quick. You didn't put the ER on Docker, so just make sure it works there. Yeah.
oh, yep. See,
See, That's,
you're
that's why we're gonna want that automation pipeline later.
Yeah. Yeah. Any small mistake while you're manually editing it and everything is host. So you shouldn't have made the correction. We can just show the mistake and then it would have been great. There are a lot of contexts here. I know if you're new to Kong, if you're new to Connect, navigating all of your options and all the components can be a little tricky. I will say this, on the left-hand side menu, every single component or object that Kong maintains is technically its own top-level object. They're all basically first-class citizens as far as management is concerned. However, there are interlinked and interdependencies, one of those being the routes and the plugins. I can click on route and I have a blank route just like the gateway service. I can click on plugin and see that there's blank plugins, just like the gateway service, and I can start making them. However, I'm making everything in the context of the service because that is the application that we want to focus on today. So back into the gateway service. Oh, I did not give this a name. Let's give this a nice, pretty name so it's not just random. We'll call this the items service. All right, there we go. All right, nice name. And you can also see inside of the service menu, I have these tabs available to me. I have my routes and my plugins. If I generate a route and a plugin from this menu, I actually set the context scope. So hit configure your first route, and you can see here that it's actually, there's no option to change the scoping. By default, this is going to be applied to the service. If I were to go make a route directly from, the routes menu, I actually have a context window where I can select the service. So those are some subtle differences. So let's go back to the service, route, new route. I'm going to go ahead and give it a path. I know from the documentation that we shared that we're listening on /items. Now, as a platform engineer or an architect or a DevOps architect, I don't really understand the nuances between all the work that Michael's been putting in, the patch, the post, delete. I'm just going to make something that works by not specifying the method. This is going to effectively allow all traffic from patch, post, put, delete into the same route match to go to the same backend target. The route object for Kong is just a pattern matching tool. So all I'm doing is when Michael sends a request to Kong, all I see is the /items path, and I've selected no method and no host. So all requests that hit the /items path will be mapped to this route, which will then be mapped to the gateway services associated with, and it'll send the traffic to his backend system. When we build the automation pipeline in place and we have the context of the different methods that Michael will have with his deployment, you'll actually see the segment of all the different methods because we need different levels of permission, we need different levels of access and governance between a simple get versus an operation like put, delete, post, patch, and all that. But for the purposes of me being platform engineer who doesn't understand that context, I'm just going to make the thing work the best that I can, and then we'll figure it out as part of the automation. The next part is this strip path. Now, by default, the path definitions are vanity. They're meant to allow you to create kind of arbitrary string values just to do the matching, and then whatever the service is implemented is like the actual path. Kong overloads URLs. So if you'll see in the future, Michael's going to use items and then items ID and things like that. With this simple, just single /items, I will remove the strip path flag, which means it'll actually be appended to the request, and any additional fields that get included, whether it's query string or additional paths, will also be included as the state. So we're maintaining RESTful state and sending the traffic as it should be. So we are attached to the service. /items is a path. I have removed strip path so that it is included in the request. I am accepting all methods. So let's go ahead and save that. Change the name real quick, just so to make it easy. So we're going to call this the items route. So save that. All right. Now, both of those definitions have been loaded in config, and in the time I've been talking, they have been populated to the data plane. So what happens is every single time a live update happens in the control plane, it is then going to propagate all of it. And you can see here, there's the in sync. So every single change, it propagates all that configuration update to all of the data planes associated. You'll get the in sync is good. So if we switch back to Michael, we should see that he's actually able to send requests to this endpoint.
All right, let's give it a try here. So remember last time I got a 404, couldn't find a route. So if that's all set up correctly, boom, there we go. 201 created. Let's try one other endpoint. Okay, so yes, everything is working. And again, these requests are not going to the backend API. They're going to the gateway. So again, it's kind of acting as a simple proxy right now, but it is functional.
If you click the headers, you can actually verify that. You can see the Kong headers being injected. So there's the X latency, the request ID. So this is just proving that Kong is in play and is actually providing functionality. And as we said before, there's no governance. There's no difference between any of these routes. So anybody that has get permissions also has edit permissions, and that's going to be a problem. So if we go back to my screen, I'm going to go ahead and just give some generic plugins to make sure that there's some sort of governance until we can actually segment these workloads and make them more granular. So back into the gateway service. And again, we have our route. Now I'm going to add a few plugins. The first plugin we'll add is our rate limiting plugin. This is probably the most widely used, ubiquitous plugin that exists. Um, I'll set I'll set something very restrictive, like 5 every 30 seconds, and then save it. And just like before, within about 10, 15 seconds, these changes have been collected and propagated to the data planes. So if we go back to Michael's screen, so click over real quick, he'll click the send button a whole bunch, and we should see we get rate limited eventually.
All right, let's give it a shot. So getting 200s, sending a bunch of requests through. Everything's going fine. And
There
then
we
boom,
go.
we get a 429, too many requests. An interesting point here to call out too is both of our tests have failed. Basically, we have a status code that we did not write a test for. So, if we go look at our response scripts, we had no way to capture this, right? We didn't know this was going to be a thing. I think in some of these, like maybe let's try our patch endpoint. Let's go ahead and fix this. Set to test. Okay, so 200s to our 429. And we actually just have no tests. And what I've done is I've actually outputted to the console a warning saying that there's no test for that status code. So again, we had handling for that 400, we had handling for the 404 and the 200. But anything else, we basically had this catch-all, this else at the end of our if else statements is basically saying, hey, if it doesn't match any of those, there's no test for that status code and kind of just output that to the console. So again, this is not something that's captured and something to kind of keep in mind as APIs go through further parts of the development lifecycle.
Oh, I'm just noticing in the chat. Yes, inside the Zoom at the very top, there should be tabs. You can click between the screens. So there should say webinar, Michael Field screen, Vince Russo screen. So that you should be able to move between them. If anybody has trouble with that, let us know. We can just okay, it looks like all right, that works. Now, Juan, you asked a really interesting question. Or, I'm sorry. Emmanuel asked a really interesting question. I think is relevant. So ticketing and events platform. Um, while yes, the answer is yes, there are some nuances to that that I don't. Michael, do you want to address eventing right now, or do you want to talk about that after the webinar?
That's kind of a whole separate category. So maybe
Okay.
let's at the end, yeah.
Yeah, and as part of the Q&A, Emmanuel, if you move that question over to the Q&A tab, we'll make sure to address that later because I think it's really important and nice, but it's not really the focus of what we're doing right now. But it's a good question. Anyways, um, oh, and the last thing we want to do, if you click back into my screen, we'll have one more, and then we'll be fully in Michael's for the rest of the webinar. I'm just adding one more plugin, so I'm going to go ahead and add a new plugin. And in this case, I know I want some sort of authentication in place, so we'll add keyauth. What this is doing is providing a security plugin that requires some sort of key value pair for keyauth. The default is to look for the name of the key to be called API key, and then we'll need to create some user with some credentials to map to that. So I'll go ahead and save it, and then back to Michael, and he can confirm that now he is simply no longer able to access the resource at all.
All right, let's give that a try real quick. So back on my screen now. Again, let's just try sending this post request in here, which just worked fine last time. We got a 201, send a request, and boom, we get a 401 unauthorized. So again, that's that key off plugin that was just applied by Vince.
Yep. Yeah. Um, And then now we need to give it some credentials. Do you have credentials set in that? Do you have an auth created already?
No, but I'll just show
Yeah.
how it is. So you just go to this Auth tab inside Insomnia. You come here to API key. We know the header we just saw from Vince's plugin config will be API key. But
What would you
now
like your password to be?
let's just do secret hyphen key. But I'm going to
Secret.
just try it here with test and just show that. Again, obviously that's not going to work.
So you do get slightly different methods. You get unauthorized because it recognizes there's a key there, but it's not the right key.
Correct.
And so you want your key to be a secret dash key.
Yep. And you want
Okay,
to show them
perfect.
how to make that consumer real quick?
Yep.
Screen.
So everyone back to my screen. I think this is the last time. We'll see.
Last one.
So like I said before, there are top level objects that Kong maintains. Gateway services, routes, plugins. The last one is consumers. Consumers are effectively objects that maintain a collection of credentials. So I'm gonna give Mike his own username. And then you can see here there's the mic consumer and then a laundry list of possible credentials to add. We're using KeyAuth plugin, so I'll use the KeyAuth credential and generate a new set of auth. Now, if I just left this blank and hit save, it would just create a GUID, and that is actually a really good security practice. This allows you to have a random number generator generate a GUID that's completely random, and then you can share those keys with your users. But we've agreed on a key because we don't want to blow up the demo, so we're going to call this secret dash key or hyphen key, save. So now that consumer has been created, that key exists, and once again, all this information is being packaged and propagated to the data planes, and it should now allow Michael access for the final time. So
All
let's
right.
switch back over to Michael's screen, and he will put that value in, and we should be good to go.
Cool. Let's give this a shot here. So let's make sure I actually type that correctly. Okay, secret key that matches. So hopefully now instead of 401, boom, we're back to a 201. Everything's working as expected. Again, if I mess the key up, I get a 401 unauthorized. So again, with the right key in there though now, with that consumer set, everything is up and running. Again, we had some authentication. If I try to hammer this endpoint, we have rate limiting. Our API has some degree of protection because of the gateway that Vince has stood up and has been configured by the platform team. Now, there's a lot of other advantages here, more than we have time to cover today. Obviously, you're going to get things like analytics and observability. All of these requests are now going to be tracked. They're going to be attributed to my consumer. We're going to see which routes are getting hit, which services are on heavy load. We can see when plugins get kicked in, organized by different status codes. So it's easy to do root cause analysis if there are issues in production. We can publish that API to a portal inside of Kong Konnect. We can manage it inside our catalog and govern it with scorecards. Again, there's a ton of power inside of Kong Konnect, far more than we can cover inside of today's developer day. But again, we at least have a basic API now stood up in front of our gateway. So what we want to do now, though, is as we saw, that was a lot of steps for just some basic stuff. We just put a rate limit on and some API key on. And Vince is great. Vince is awesome SE, and he's done this before, so he's pretty good, and everything went pretty smooth today. But especially when you're talking about APIs in production, where you're talking about hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of endpoints you have to manage, and all these different security protocols and all these different plugins, humans are inherently error prone. Something will go wrong in production. Murphy's Law, give it enough time.
Oh yeah, I just made a mistake and I think we practiced this like 6 times, so I was already as familiar as I am with this and as smooth as we made this, I was about to make another error. So it happens every, 6 times a day.
Exactly. Things are going to go wrong. You want this pipeline to, again, you want a repeatable pipeline, something that's auditable that you can trust to run the same way every time. And again, it's just much less error prone than humans. So what we're going to do now is we're going to basically blow all of Vince's hard work up. So to do that, let me switch over to my Connect screen. So if I actually refresh, and as Vince mentioned, he could only see this one control plane. I'm an admin, so I have access to all sorts of things. Service catalog, the portal, I have access to analytics.
You want to show them the analytics real quick, see all the different status codes that just got generated?
Yeah, so if we go into the analytics for this particular service, again, we could see these coming in. We can see the 401s for the unauthorized. I could go deeper here. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do, and different filters by different time zones, or not time zones, but different just time amounts. I'm looking at the last 6 hours. I could hone in on the last 15 minutes. There's all sorts of different things. I could look at response latency, a lot of cool stuff we can see here. But again, in just the interest of time, we're going to focus now on how do we do this from an automated perspective. So again, I can see what Vince created here, but I'm going to go ahead and blow all this up. So I'm going to do this with Deck. So I'm going to leave our API up and running, and I'm basically just going to open up a new tab in the terminal, and I'm going to run this Deck gateway reset command. Um, and basically, you need to have a personal access token set up to use something like Deck. So inside of Deck here, you can come here, you can go to your personal access tokens, generate one, and then pass it to your Deck CLI tool. But we only have about 15 minutes left today. So I'm going to kind of speed through this. You can learn a lot more about the deck and the inso CLI and how that works. But I'm going to go ahead and reset that control plane. So sorry about that, Vince. And we can see everything Vince just set up has been deleted. Just so folks believe me, if I refresh Connect now, we can see there's no service, there's no route, there's no plugins. Basically, this is a completely empty control plane. And if I go back to Insomnia, I'm not going to get a 429 or a 401 or a 200. Basically, I'm going to get a 404 not found because, again, that service no longer exists. So what we want to do now is basically cover everything we just did, all the way from linting this initial spec to pushing it inside of Kong Konnect, creating the service, all the routes and all the plugins, and running our tests. So what we have set up here inside of our GitHub repository is we have a GitHub action set up. Now, again, to run this, you'd actually need to clone the repo, or not to clone the repo, you're going to need to fork the repo to run these actions because I'm the only one with the owner permissions, but you'll still have access to this action, this one called Kong Declarative Automation. And let's take a look at the details here. We're going to click on this APIops.yaml file. And again, this is under the .github/workflows directory. And we can see the details here. So basically we had this job running and we're actually going to be deploying this. I know it's an automated pipeline, but we're going to be deploying it manually for today's demo. But you can deploy this a number of different ways. You know, if you wanted to deploy anytime there's a commit push to the main branch or a pull request is merged, that's all stuff you can do with GitHub Actions and most of your kind of CI/CD automation tooling. So if you're using something like Jenkins as well. And then we have a number of different steps. So we're going to install some different things. Of course, we're going to install our Deck CLI tooling and our inso CLI tooling. Like I mentioned, things can go wrong even during an automation pipeline. There can be conflicts. You can have network issues, but things can kind of freeze up. And so we always want to back up our existing configuration so we have something to roll back to. And Deck makes that super easy to do. Now, imagining again, a very common workflow is okay, a PR has been merged into main, and every time a PR is merged or a commit is made, we want to run this pipeline. So imagining what we did today where we started with that patch endpoint I made. So I made these updates. I created this new patch endpoint. I took the design first approach and I make these updates. And now I basically, I push those changes to the repo. So we want to go ahead and lint that spec, make sure that spec is following all the kind of organizational guidelines for what should be inside that spec. You know, it could be styling rules, it could be best practices, it could be just standard open API spec rules. If that passes, we'll move on to the next step. We'll convert that open API spec into Kong specific configuration. And then we're going to patch that with some things. If you want to dive into the details later, you can see everything that's being patched. But the main thing is I need to tell inside of there basically what control plane are we targeting. So maybe just showing that real quick. You know, we're patching some different things, making some different modifications. But I need to say, hey, this API is meant for the Insomnia Dev Day control plane. And that matches what we have inside of Kong Konnect, Insomnia Dev Day here. And so that's the main thing that we're patching there. Okay, so now that's part of the deck file. We gone ahead and pushed that in. Now we need to add in all the plugins and consumers that Vince just created. So we're basically going to add in a rate limiting plugin and a key off plugin. And we also need to go ahead and patch in some consumers. So if we take a look at this and we go to our plugins, we can see all of the config for basically adding in a rate limit down here and a key off plugin up here. Now, again, this might seem like a lot to write if you're starting out, but a cool thing is you can always start in the UI and then you can basically run what's called deck gateway dump and dump all this configuration to a YAML file. So you can start in the UI, configure these plugins how you see fit, and then you can extract all this config and store it in some kind of version control like your GitHub repo. Now, there's some other interesting things going on where we're actually applying this to specific routes, but I'll show what that looks like after we run the automation pipeline. Okay. So again, this is kind of something like the platform team would manage this aspect, making sure, they manage the overall automation pipeline and again, all these kind of security and auth plugins. Then with that set, we actually want to apply these changes to our control plane with those new plugins. And then basically the last step here is kind of a catch-all. If any of the previous steps fail, that's why we have this if statement here. Basically notify them that something did go wrong and roll back the changes. So basically when we did this backup existing configuration, we did run that debt gateway dump and we stored it in this Kong backup YAML file. And if something else goes wrong, anything during this automation pipeline, we're basically going to roll back to that Kong backup YAML file. Okay. So again, that's all the work that, Vince and I basically did over 45 minutes and, 10 kind of automation pipeline steps here. So let's go ahead and give this a shot now. So we're going to go over here to the Actions tab. We're going to go over to our workflow. Again, this could be triggered automatically, but we have this workflow dispatch event trigger set up. So you can just run the workflow here. And let's go ahead and run it. Okay, so it's been run successfully. So now we can see that this is in progress. So let's go ahead and check it out. You can see that things are starting to run here. It's going to go through each of the steps, install everything that's needed, back up the configuration, lint the spec, add the plugins, and basically push that into Connect. So that configuration's been applied. It's going to clean up the job. And we can see now that it was successful, got a green check mark, and that was all done in 16 seconds. So again, even if there's rapid development going on, this is a pipeline that can run every single time. So every time we want to make a new change, we have multiple teams work on this API, people are moving quickly, and everybody's pushing changes. Obviously you're probably going to have these through PRs and separate branches, but as those get reviewed and merged, this pipeline can run every time. And now if we go back to Connect and we refresh, we do have a gateway service. We have our item API. And you're going to notice something interesting here. Instead of one route, we had kind of that catch-all route that Vince had set up that managed all the different methods and all the different endpoints, because it would have been a lot of manual work to create all these different endpoints. But with our automation pipeline, that was very easy to set up. So again, now we have all 6 of our endpoints that match our 6 endpoints inside of the collection. And so what that allows us to do is we've actually assigned these plugins to particular endpoints here. So if you look at our plugins, we have a key auth here, but we can see here it's not applied to the whole service. It's applied to a particular route or particular endpoint. So I can see the route ID, and if I click on it, we can see that the that the key auth is specifically applied to the post, the create item endpoint. If we go back and look at the rate limit, we can see that this is specifically applied to the get items endpoint. So basically, the read access, we don't want people hammering the read access. And for the ability to create new items, we want to make sure they're an authenticated user. Imagining downstream when you have a full-blown application, maybe we only want signed in users creating new tasks and items to make sure we can associate that with a particular account. So let's test this all out now. So let's jump back to Insomnia. Everything is hopefully up and running. First, let's try to get items again. So run this. Okay, it is working. We can get our items. Let's keep sending some requests in, and boom, we get our 429 too many requests. So it is back up and running. So now let's go here. Let's turn off our auth. We get a 401. Let's turn it back on. Make sure we have our secret key here. And boom, 201 created. So again, all of that by just running one automation workflow. We've taken, kind of the simulation of a new endpoint being created by the backend engineer. Maybe they push a PR into the GitHub repo. It's been reviewed. The patch endpoint itself looks good. Now they merge it onto the main branch. That triggered our entire automation workflow to run. And we went in and basically set up a gateway service. We went up and set all these routes up for that API. We applied plugins to particular routes. Again, this could be many more plugins, maybe plugins set for each of these available routes, but all done as part of that automated pipeline with the gateway now running in front of the API, making things ready for production, having something that covers the entire API lifecycle ready to go. And again, tied to that CI/CD pipeline. So with that, I think we only have, 5, 10 minutes left, and I'm seeing a lot of stuff in the chat. So let's go ahead and pause there and make sure we have some time to go ahead and wrap up on this workshop. I'll stop sharing my screen there. Vince, I don't know if you've been monitoring and seen any kind of theme to the questions coming through, but we can start.
We have a few. The first one I think is probably the more interesting one. Not to say all the questions aren't good, but it actually relates to something that is going on within Kong as a product internally is events and ticketing, specifically with Insomnia, but I think that's an interesting question. How do we handle eventing, um, both as Insomnia as a tool, and then what is Kong as I guess, a company doing for eventing and things like that?
Yeah, so I can touch on the eventing, but I do want to clarify because I said ticketing and eventing. If you meant something else by that and kind of that category, please clarify. But just touching on it real quick is, yeah, like Vince has mentioned, and obviously everything we've been working on today with the REST API is a particular protocol, and we're going to support all the synchronous protocols. So, whether you're using GraphQL, I guess gRPC is kind of fuzzy, but we also support async protocol, so things like WebSockets, server sent events and really expanding that into the eventing world. So if you haven't seen, we recently announced the event gateway, so we can manage things like Kafka streams directly on the Connect side. So there's actually a event specific gateway for managing those event streams, and that's still in beta right now. And long term, we hope to have support for that inside Insomnia as well. So yeah, definitely a good thing to touch on. If that's not what you meant and you meant something totally different about eventing, it's totally possible. Just have a clarification in there, and we'll circle back on that question.
Yep. Can automated tests be added to the pipeline? Um, yeah,
So
yeah.
to clarify on that real quick and why we did not do that is basically 100% because we installed that inso CLI. So when we use the inso CLI, we did it for the linting at the beginning, but we can also call certain collections of tests. So if we wanted to run batches of collections, so if we wanted to run basically all the tests that we've been seeing inside Insomnia today for that particular API, for that items API, we could run that at the end of the automation pipeline. Now, again, the reason I didn't do that today is because the GitHub action is running up in GitHub's cloud. But the gateway we deployed is just a gateway that I was running locally using Docker Desktop. So it's going to be difficult to have them communicate because you can't reach the gateway on my local computer. But obviously in a real production setup, you know, your gateway is going to be running, well, it's either going to be totally air gapped alongside your GitHub repositories, or it might be running in the cloud somewhere. And that way your automation pipelines will be able to talk to that gateway. But yes, that's certainly a huge part. So, after you make all these changes and you run in these plugins, if one of those tests fail, then you can immediately roll back to the previous configuration. You can notify all your developers, hey, this particular test failed. We need to take a closer look at what went wrong. But while that is going on, while that root cause analysis is occurring, everything will stay up and running because the automation pipeline automatically rolled back to the previous version. So great question there.
All right, we have two questions that are very similar vein, and it's obviously, I think, somewhat of the elephant in the room, Insomnia versus Postman. There's a specific question around pre and post scripts where Postman has it and wondering if Insomnia does, and then what are the major differences between the two? I don't know how much detail we want to go in here, but you can at least stress the first part of that.
Yeah, I can touch on all that real quick. So let me share my screen one more time. So first on the pre and post request scripting. So that's actually where we wrote all the tests, right? So inside of each of these endpoints, if we go here and we go to we have pre-request right here, which we weren't really utilizing, but we also have our after response. This is where we are writing all of our tests. Now, again, it's not just limited to tests actually inside of the post endpoint. If you look closely, you'll see that anytime it's a 201, so we successfully created a new task. Part of what we do is we basically grab the ID in the response and we update the environment variable. So if we look at our environments and we go to our main environment, we can see this ID. Basically, anytime, again, we create a new task. So let's go ahead and create a new item just to see this. So we see it's 623. That after response script has gone in here and updated that to 623. And that's nice because now all these other endpoints can leverage it. So if I want to grab that particular item, basically that variable is already set and I can send a request. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with the scripting, different response chaining, but of course, a huge part of that is running your test. Um, Now, kind of expanding upon pre-request and post-response scripting and kind of how we compare to Postman, I would say, broadly speaking, that there's kind of two major differentiators for Insomnia. First and foremost, is the storage flexibility, right? So Postman is all cloud storage, but what Insomnia allows you to do is integrate with your GitHub repo of choice. So I could come here and I could point to a particular GitHub repo where I want to store all my data. And again, so no data has to be stored in the cloud. All this scripting, all your environment variables, everything else can be stored wherever you would like, and you do not have to share that with the Insomnia cloud. Again, the Insomnia cloud is encrypted, but you still have the flexibility to choose where you want your data stored. Now, the other huge piece of this, which kind of ties back to a previous question about running tests during the automation pipeline, is Insomnia is going to charge you to run collections. So what we're looking at here is a collection. If I want, I can come here and I can run this entire collection. So I could just do a single iteration and I can see, okay, what kind of issues are we having here? And I can run as many iterations I would like. I can supply different kinds of data. So part of an automation pipeline, typically you're going to be running these collections probably multiple times, testing for different things. You could have tens, hundreds, or even thousands of unit tests that need to run. With Insomnia, you get unlimited collection runs. With Postman, you're going to have to pay for these collection runs, and there's going to be a cost associated with them. So those are usually the two main reasons I kind of like to highlight as differentiators for Insomnia.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that. I answered a few inside the chat. Insomnia integration with Git. And I think this is actually it's not hidden, but it's a fundamental aspect of the project. When you go to create a new project inside of Insomnia, there's actually a window that pops up that tells you which one to select. Do you want to show that real quick?
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Yeah. So the second you hit new project, a wizard pops up and it tells you local storage, Insomnia sync, Insomnia Cloud sync, or Git sync.
So
So
this is the overall project. Again, if you're kind of familiar, or if you're not familiar with the object model inside of Insomnia, you can go back and check out the 101 workshop where we cover organizations, projects, and all the different object types like documents and collections and how those work. But basically, coming in here, if you want to create a new project, we've been working inside the Insomnia Workshop project, like Vince mentioned. You can immediately choose how you want data stored inside that project. So if you just want to keep it completely local, if you want to encrypt it inside the Insomnia cloud, or if you want to utilize Git sync for using your own repositories to store the data, those are all options. So great call out there, Vince.
yep. Um, yeah, okay. So I think this will be the last question we answer, since we are almost at time. They want to know, routes and configuration, but can it be the spec used? Part of the pipeline, if you actually go to the repo, you'll actually see that process happen. There is a command within the Git actions call right there. Uh, deck file open API to Kong. That is the component that actually takes the path definitions and converts it to Kong specific YAML. So that is actually how you can use the design-driven approach with an open API spec to generate Kong scaffolding and then use that to publish to Kong and set up all your routes and your service configurations.
Yeah, and all the details are in here, but you can see basically inside the config folder, it's starting with this open API specification. So starting here, this is exactly what we've been working with inside to today, inside Insomnia. So again, going back to Insomnia, looking at our document. So essentially, you're imagining in a real world use case, this is something that gets pushed in with the commit, and then we're going to check it and say, okay, let's go ahead and lint the spec, make sure everything looks good. And then we can use that as the basis again for actually generating the Kong config. So again, generating the Kong configuration, which becomes this deck file. So this is like the starting deck file where we can see all those routes have been generated from the different endpoints. And then the later steps are kind of layering different things into this deck file, adding in plugins, patching in different things. You can also modify certain things. You can set different defaults. So that's part of what's going on in this patch file. I'm changing, some of the structure and the paths of these routes inside of the patch file. Again, I'm adding in plugins, I'm adding in consumers. And basically all that gets added into this final deck file. And that's what gets pushed into Connect. And that's how we kind of get this final result with all the routes, all the plugins, and the consumer created.
All right.
Sweet. Looks like we're a bit over time here, but a lot of great questions, a lot of engagement. So appreciate the folks who took the time to stay the whole time. Thanks again to Vince for joining us. Hopefully that was a helpful workshop for folks. And again, that repo is available publicly. If you weren't able to follow along today, that should be something that you can do at any point in your own time. But yeah, thanks again, folks, for joining.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael, Vince. Amazing. Thanks everyone for staying so the whole time and for all of your insightful questions. And yeah, like Vince and Michael mentioned several times, we will send the recording in the next 24 hours. It will be also on YouTube. I will post the link here again. And we hope to see you at our next event. Hope you have a good day, good night, and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.